Thanks, Doug. Let me see. Get this. Oh, wrong slide. So, hi everyone. Oh, hang on. Okay. I'm Peter. I'm from the media workflow infrastructure team at Netflix. I'm the primary contributor to the user experience for Conductor here at Netflix. And I'm also the maintainer for the UI portion of the open source code base. So first, I'll do a quick recap from the last time we spoke at this venue. So in 2021, we launched Conductor 3, and as part of that, the UI was rebuilt. So rebuilt as a pure single-page React app. So it's no longer utilizes a separate node backend. Instead, it interfaces directly with the Conductor API, server API. So that, I think, helped a lot with scalability issues. And the UI was redesigned. We revamped the workflow visualization, the task and timeline views, now available, as a separate part of the site, as well as a search and discovery experience. So this slide from last time. So we see the before and after. But today I want to talk about a couple of features that we didn't get around to cover a couple months ago, and they are the definition editor and the workflow workbench. So the definition editor is available for both workflow and task definitions right now. It's basically a tool for you to create and modify definitions directly in the UI. And if you use the Orcus Playground, you'll see a slightly different variation of the tool. The one that's distributed with open source has gone through a little more iteration, but it's largely the same functionality. And we use a Monaco-based JSON editor. So it's open source project released by Microsoft. It's what backs the VS Code IDE. So if you're familiar with that, you'll recognize the look and feel. And we support version management of your workflow versions. Yeah, so I actually have a pre-recorded demo that I'm gonna kick off. There we go.
Of the Conductor workflow editor. In the first step of this demo, I will create a new workflow definition. Let's start from the Definitions tab, and we'll click New Workflow Definition. Here, the workflow editor loads with a boilerplate definition, but see that the Save button is grayed out, and that's because there is a validation error. The validation error is backed by a rudimentary JSON schema, and we hope to bring more sophistication to this schema in the near future using source-based code generation. But in the meanwhile, we can see that the workflow name is not defined, and we'll fix the error by giving this workflow a name. We also have simple JSON syntax validation running in the background that will block the Save button when there's an invalid JSON. Now there's a button here to hide the visualization and maximize the code editor space. I'm going to save this workflow. This is a div view showing the changes being committed, and when creating a new workflow from scratch, it's not very interesting, so we'll just go ahead and save it. Now the workflow definition has been saved, and the workflow name is visible in the toolbar. In this next step, I'm going to make some changes to the definition. Let's add a task, and we'll add some values to the input parameters also. We can right-click to format the JSON. This is the open source Monaco editor, which you'd be familiar with if you've used Microsoft VS Code. Let's click the Save button again. Now you can see the div view is more useful, and pay attention to the version number that's been incremented automatically because we've checked this automatically set version checkbox. Now, Conductor workflow versions are not immutable, so if you want, you can simply uncheck this to overwrite your existing version number. We'll go ahead and commit the change. And you can see that the visualization updates upon successful save. Now, coming soon, we're working on a preview button that will attempt to render the workflow even if it's a work in progress. Finally, I'll demonstrate how to clone a workflow definition. So let me open up a different workflow here. You can flip through the various past versions. To clone it to a different name, all you have to do is change the name attribute in the JSON. Let's click Save and observe that the version number has reset to 1. Now you might think that it would be easy to inadvertently override an existing definition. However, there are safeguards to protect against that. Let's try a definition name that already exists. The UI will block you from cloning over an existing definition. Now there's also a task editor UI that's essentially a simplified version of this, what you saw earlier for workflow definitions. So I won't repeat the demo.
All right, so that's the get my slides back. So that was the demo for the definition editor. And as I mentioned in the video there, the upcoming enhancements are going to focus around improving the scope of the validation schema, previewing your workflow DAG, even as you develop the workflow definition without having to save it first, and as well as to cover event handler definitions, which are currently not supported through the editor. The next feature I want to demonstrate is the workflow workbench. And this is a tool to run workflows manually from the UI. So it provides an alternative to today where you would go in the Swagger UI or manipulate the REST endpoint and post endpoint to create a new workflow execution. So it allows you to try out your workflows with different inputs. It has a history feature that's based on a browser level local storage, so scoped to the browser that you're using, but it allows for observability of both trigger variations and the execution history. So I will show a demo of this feature.
Bench. This is a feature that allows you to run workflows directly from the UI and keep track of successive trigger configurations. So let's start by picking a workflow. We'll use the workflow definition that we created earlier. We can leave the workflow version blank to use the latest, or we can select from one of the available options. This button here will populate the input payload from the input parameters array. You'll recall that we added these two keys to our input parameters earlier. Let me fill this out with some test values. I think we're ready to run the workflow. Just to set your expectation, this workflow is not expected to succeed. We'll see it fail shortly. When we click run, the workflow ID associated with the execution is populated in this panel on the right. When we click on it, we'll link out to the execution view, which will allow you to understand what happened. We can rerun this trigger configuration multiple times with no change, and each time the execution instance will populate on the right hand side with the associated workflow ID. On the other hand, if we modify the input payload and we click run, you can see that because this time the trigger payload has changed, instead of populating another execution instance, we've pushed a new item onto our run history stack on the left. This allows you to go back and review trigger configurations that you have used in the past, as well as review the execution for each of these variations separately.
All right, I think there's a second part to this.
Button which will save your trigger configuration without running it, and you can come back at a later point in time to trigger an execution.
All right, so that's the demo for the workflow workbench. Just to summarize what we hope to do with it moving forward. We want to support ad hoc workflow definitions so that you're able to experiment with entire workflow definitions without having to save them, with a version per system first. We want to integrate more tightly with the workflow editor so that it becomes a seamless experience to modify a definition, test it, and commit the changes once behavior is satisfactory. And one of our upcoming features for the backend is a debugger feature that will allow you to, have finer grain control over the workflow execution flow. So, pause and restart a workflow with changes to a task input, such capabilities. So we will work to integrate that into the Workbench UI as well. And finally, I'll give you a preview of a visual redesign that we've undertaken on the documentation side. Some of you may have seen our current documentation site. It's kind of obscure. It's linked to from the README, the GitHub project, and it's works, but it's not the most modern public presence for the project. So we have a redesigned version of this doc site that we're going to deploy with new branding that we will integrate into the UI, the application UI, as well as throughout our documentation. So with that, that's all I have for this meetup. Feel free to reach out to me. Take questions now, of course, but also on GitHub. If you post in the discussion or the issues section of our GitHub, I'll address any and all issues.
Awesome. Well, that was great, Peter. Thank you so much. we've got one question. By debugger, do you mean that the user will be able to add breakpoints in the workflow and to pause the subsequent task executions and provide a panel in the UI so you can evaluate the inputs and outputs of the executed task?
Yeah, that's roughly what we have in mind. I don't know if either Anoop or Arvinden is on the Zoom, but if they'd like to chime in.
They are, and I can get them where they can talk. Here, let me just.
Actually, Arvinden might be the best resource for answering the features on the back end that are being proposed.
There we go. You've now got permission to talk.
Nope.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Oh, it's just a sort of a overview of what we have planned for the debug feature in terms of breakpoints, pausing execution.
Yeah, I can shed some light on it. So basically, the debug option, the debugger would allow a workflow to pause after each task, and through the UI, whoever is debugging the workflow would be able to modify the input for the next task, and they can also set the output for the previous task and let the input take its course. So it'll the initial set of features would just allow, instead of starting a workflow, there would be an API which would allow a workflow to be started in debug mode. And when it's in debug mode, after each task is complete, it'll pause, and then the user has the opportunity to change the input or output of the previous task or the input of the next task, and then continue with the workflow. We do not have any plans to support step in or step out or run through a certain number of tasks and set a specific breakpoint, at least not in the first version that we are planning. So the first version would always stop after every task.
The next question is, of course, what's the timeline?
It will be Q2 or Q3 of this year. So we've already started our design work on it, and then we will be testing it out internally, and then it'll be available in open source sometime in Q3.
Great. Awesome. And I saw a sneak peek of the docs yesterday, so I'm super excited to see, to have our docs updated, and we'll keep working on updating the docs and making them better. But of course, making them look nice is a huge step in that direction as well. All right. Well, thank you. We can hang out for a little longer to see if there are any more questions for our speakers or just about Conductor in general. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining and listening to our speakers, who gave excellent talks on how they're using Conductor. And it was really neat to see, the disparate talks. We've got data science, and we have third parties and onboarding of users and entities, which was really cool as well. But we can hang out for another couple minutes for questions. And then again, also, Peter, thank you so much for, and to the team for all the great work on making Conductor a better tool for all of us to use. Really excited to see all those changes coming in future releases of Conductor. I'm going to share my screen now. Kick ahead. We've had our 3 great speakers. So with that, again, I'm Doug Sillers. I'm at Orcus. Orcus is we're working very closely with the Netflix team to improve Conductor. We have a cloud-based version of Netflix Conductor. If you're interested in trying out, come check us out at orcus.io. You can follow us on Twitter at orcus.io. A couple links for you in case you're interested. Peter brought this up, but there is a playground. It is a fully fledged multi-tenant version of Conductor that's live on the internet. You can just sign in for free with a Google email and start building workflows right away. And there's some sample workflows that you can get started with right away inside our playground. We have a Discord channel where we talk all things Conductor. If you have questions, feel free to come there and we'll try to help you out and solve your issues with whatever you're seeing inside Conductor. We're doing a hackathon. We're trying to help people build their first workflows. And so we have a contest. So if you've got some cool workflows that you'd like to submit to our hackathon, you could submit there. And then finally, the last link here on the page is to the GitHub repository for Conductor. And if you're using Conductor, give us a star, fork it, this is where there's great discussions going on in the discussions section. It's sort of one of the central places where we can talk about Conductor. And so with that,
Doug, by the way, I just saw that there's a question in the chat from James regarding Next.js on the UI. So
right.
Quickly, yeah. So yeah, no, I think that's definitely. So I'm actually, I'm quite familiar with Next.js. We have several teams at Netflix that have sort of deployed it. Now I think whether we introduce that into Conductors is going to depend a lot on our deployment. First of all, our deployment environment internally at Netflix and sort of what makes sense, and then I think whether the open source community sort of has appetite for that layer of abstraction. So it's definitely open for discussion.
Thanks, Peter. I saw that one and then I got caught up in the Q&A questions. So thanks for catching it. And Ahmed, I hope that answered your question. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Great meetup again. We're going to have another one in May, probably in about 3.5 weeks. So we've got some speakers already in the pipeline, hopefully, that are willing to give some more talks. If you, one of the attendees, is interested in giving a talk, feel free to reach out to me. You can DM us at Orcus.io, or you can reach out to me specifically. And on Twitter, I'm Doug Sillers. And volunteer to give a talk. We'd love to hear how people are using Conductor in their day-to-day workflows.